Hello, my name is Rob Brown, and I am the Director of Technology at Foxcroft Academy. And today we're going to talk about a script that I created uh, to create Google Classroom classes from existing Jamf Pro classes using the Jamf Pro API and the GAM tool. So we're going to talk about what inspired me to create this script and how it came about. We'll talk a little bit about the GAM tool itself and a little bit about the API. Then we'll look at the Perl and Bash scripts that I created. And at the end, we'll just talk about some of the limitations of my script and some of the future enhancements I'd like to incorporate into the script. So a little bit about who we are. As I said, I'm from Foxcroft Academy. We are a boarding and day school, and we are located in Dover, Foxcroft, Maine, a little town just over 4,000 people near the geographic center of the state of Maine. We are in Piscataqua County, which is usually the first or second poorest county in the state. We do have the smallest population, but yet we are the largest county, about 4,400 square miles, which is larger than Rhode Island and Delaware combined, but a little bit smaller than Connecticut. As I said, we are a boarding and day school. We have about 450 students from approximately 20 different countries around the world. We were the first high school in the state of Maine to go one-to-one with iPad rollout back in 2011. So what inspired me to write this script was back in March of 2020. It was a Thursday, and we were getting ready for a large technology conference with the surrounding schools. We were expecting 500 educators to come. It was professional development based all around technology. Gearing all up for that, all stressed out about that. And then about 8 o'clock Thursday night, we get a call that the conference is canceled because of COVID. And we're going to have to just postpone it. The next Saturday, the following Saturday, we got a call that we're going to be closed for 2 weeks because of COVID. And shortly after that, we got the call that we're going to be going remote learning until at least April vacation, and then even that changed, and we were going remote learning for the rest of the year. So many of our teachers, since we really never did remote learning, had no experience with doing any kind of remote learning. So there was a lot of stress on their part, a lot of stress on my part on how I'm going to help support this. Some of our teachers had been using a Google Classroom because we are a Google Workspace for Education institution. Some of our teachers used Edmodo. Some had been using Seesaw, even Blackboard and Moodle. We didn't require them to use any particular one. We let them decide on their own. But now where every teacher had to do it, we decided we needed to standardize how we were going to implement this remote learning. And we chose to go with Google Classroom because of our existing Google Workspace for Education affiliation. So we had a varied level of experience for people using online learning, but most of them had little to no experience. So there was a lot of questions coming, not just my way, every way. How are we going to do this? How do we do it? So I decided that I had some tools that I'd been using in the past. One was this GAM tool that I use to work with student accounts. And I decided, let's see what the GAM tool will do with Google Workspace, Google Classroom options. And I started looking into that, and I found that it actually was pretty powerful. The GAM tool is available on GitHub. It is written by, I don't know if it's J0 Lee or J.O. Lee, but it's touted as a command line tool for Google Workspace admins to manage domain and user settings quickly and easily. And it does just that. It took a little bit to get set up, but once it's set up, it's a very powerful tool. So we'd already been using the Jamf Pro API to actually set up static user groups based on our classes from our student information system. So already, just because we used it to assign apps and profiles, we had a system in place where it would pull from our student information system and create classes in Jamf Pro, not create classes, excuse me, create static user groups in the Jamf Pro server. That was already in place. So since that was there, I started looking at how I can use Perl, which I've been using Perl for quite a while now, probably since the late 90s, to actually automate some of this stuff with the Google Classroom. So I found that if I installed a few modules for Perl, I could actually create a script that would do what I needed it to do. So I found that I needed to add the LWP module in Perl, which added some core functionality for web programming. I needed to use the HTTP module, which actually is the module that allowed me to query the Jamf Pro server and get back the XML. And they also had to use the XML module to actually parse and work with that XML. All of those were available right from my distribution. We are a on-premise installation, so we're running Jamf Pro server on our Linux server. So I just installed those directly from my package manager in Debian Linux, but you can also install them directly from CPN. And originally I wrote it in Perl. As I said, that's what I'm comfortable with. I've been using it for years. But I also knew that a lot of people prefer Bash. So I thought, just for fun, because, IT people don't have much else to do, let's try to rewrite it in Bash. So I also wrote a version of it in Bash. And for the Bash, the only extra thing I needed was a little program called XML Starlet that helps me to process the XML that is returned. So as I said, since we wrote this for our school, it's very specific to our school. So the script has some assumptions that it makes about the environment. One of them is the way that we use our set up our classes. All our classes are based on student groups. As you can see here, we have a class called Academic Support 101.1. It consists of teachers, and it doesn't consist of any students directly. It consists of student groups. In this case, this class has a student group called Academic Support 101.1 and Advisory 104.1. So those two student groups that have been already created from another process from our student information system make up this class. And one of the things that we did is set up our classes in our student groups to have the same name. So you can see here, my class is called Academic Support 101.1. In the group is also Academic Support 101.1. Makes it very easy to follow. Another assumption is that we have common usernames in both Jamf and Google Workspace. So here's an example of some fake student names. On the left, we have our student names, and on the right is their email address, and that's the same as we use in Google Workspace. So on the Jamf Pro side, we have their first name dot last name, and on the Google Workspace side, it's the same first name dot last name, just with the @foxcroftacademy.org appended. And as I said, we have some common class names that we use between our groups and our classes. And we also use that same naming over in our Google Workspace. Here, for example, you see on the left, the third and fourth class down, Biology CP 422.2 and Biology CP 422.3. The class name is Biology CP, which there are two classes, but there are multiple sections. So all the class names have to be unique. So what I did is just appended the course number 422 with the section number 0.2. So you can see here I have about in the middle on the left, I have Chemistry 437.1, and that's my Jamf class. And over on the right is my Google classes. I have a corresponding Chemistry 437.1. So this script does work just for a single Jamf site because that's what we have. So I wrote it for that. And it does assume that everybody that's a user on the Jamf Pro server side has an active account over on the Google Workspace side. If they don't have an active account, running through the script, it'll throw an error and move on to the next course. So let's take a look at the workflow of how this script works. It's really pretty simple with only one kind of hiccup in the middle. But basically what it does is it uses the API to go and get a list of all the classes in the Jamf Pro server. And then it loops through all the classes one by one, processing each class. And what it does is it looks first at the first class that it gets from Jamf Pro, and then it queries over to Google Workspace and says, does this class exist over here? If it does, it's going to move on and update the teacher list of that class. If it doesn't, it then goes and uses the API to get the first listed teacher in that class and then add it to a list. And then it creates that class from that list of one teacher. And then it goes and it updates that new class that it just created with all the teachers that are listed in that Jamf class. Then what it does, at that point, we've got we've got a new course or an updated course in an updated list of teachers. Then it goes and it's going to update the list of students. And the way it does that is another set of nested loops where it queries the Jamf Pro server for all the student groups in that class. And it processes each of those groups. If there's one, obviously it just processes one, but it will go through all of them. And it takes the group and then it uses the API to query that group and get a list of the classes, writes them all out into a file. And then if it's the last class, it continues on. If it's not the last class, it goes and gets the next class and appends that to the list. So by the time we're done, we've got a list of all the students in all the groups. And then it takes that list and it, using the GAM tool, it updates the Google Classroom with a list of new students. So now I've got a class with an updated list of teachers and an updated list of students, and then it moves on to the next class if it exists. If it doesn't, that's the end of the script. So let's take a look at this GAM tool real briefly. Like I said, it's real powerful. It does a lot of interesting and fun things, but we're just going to look at three of the options that you can run from the command line for this script. One of them is creating a course. The other is updating the owner of a course, and the last one is syncing the teachers or students with that course. So we're looking here at the GAM tool for creating a course, and the format is GAM, the command itself, create, tell it a course, you tell it the name of the course. In this case, we're creating Bio 227.6. We tell it we're going to use an alias for the name, Bio 227.6. I use the alias because the teachers actually don't see very easily what the course number and section are. So that's not very significant to them. They might want to change the course to say Bio period 1A. And they can change the alias, but they can't change the name without it creating a new class. So it gives them the ability to actually customize the name. So it also adds me as the teacher. You can see it says teacher and then robert.brown@foxcroftacademy.org, and it creates the course with a status of archived. As I said, some of our teachers are already using Google Classroom, so I didn't want to flood them with a whole bunch of new classes. Just all of a sudden showed up in their workspace there. I create them as archived, and then if they want to use the classes that I created, they can actually go into the archive section of Google Classroom and make those active. The other option that we use in the GAM tool is to update a course. And in this script, the only thing that I really update here is the owner of the course. And the format here is GAM, update, course, the course name, and the owner, the new owner name. Here I'm updating the owner to Mr. Ritano. This is where things probably need to explain a little bit about the different types of users that the Google Classroom has. The Google Classroom has a owner, a single owner, can have multiple teachers and multiple students. The owner must be a teacher, but not all teachers are owners. So there comes a little hiccup if you're changing the teacher of a class, and we'll get to that when we look at the script. I'll explain that a little bit more. And then we have the other other GAM command that actually does the work of actually syncing the students and teachers. This option has several different ways of syncing students and teachers. I chose the option to sync them from a file. So my script actually writes a bunch of usernames to a file, and then it syncs those files, syncs that file. The option here is GAM course. You tell it again the course name. You tell it that you're going to do a sync, and you let it know, are you syncing students or teachers? And then you tell it the file that you're using a file and where the location is. In my example, the file is /temp/Google_sync dash, and then that's actually a date there. So now let's actually take a look at the Perl script that I wrote, the first script, and then we'll take a look at the bash after that. So as I said, it uses 3 modules. So right at the beginning of my Perl script, I load those modules, the LWP module, the HTTP module, and the XML module. Then I set a bunch of variables. The first one being the URL of my Jamf Pro server. Then the next 2 actually are used by the HTTP module to actually talk to the Jamf Pro server. Then I have my Jamf API username, which I put right in the script. Then I have a little subroutine that actually goes and reads that user's password from a file stored in etc. That file is only readable by root and is very well protected, so that someone can't, without root access to this Linux server, can't actually get to that password. I tell it a spool file where it's actually going to save the spool file that it's going to sync, and there I just have /temp/Google_classroom_sync, and I append the date to it so that in case it's running multiple times, there'll be a unique file. And then I tell it the actual location of the GAM tool and store that in the variable GAM. So I did create in the script, if you're looking at the script at the bottom, a subroutine that actually does the querying of the Jamf Pro server, rather than have all this written right into the code every time I want to query the Jamf Pro server. I just created a little subroutine that you pass the subroutine the resource you want, for example, classes, and then it does the query and spits back the XML from the Jamf Pro server. So we actually look at the script as it starts. The first thing it does is it calls that subroutine query_API, and it's going to get all the classes, and it puts it in the variable classes. And if that is successful, it's going to go on and process something. If it isn't successful, meaning there was an error or that didn't find any classes, it just quits out. But the first thing it does is it actually gets the content of that query, and the XML module actually processes that. I figure out the number of classes that I have queried so I can create my for loop. And then I just run my for loop with a counter until my counter is less than the number of classes. And then I print out just a little statement that tells me I'm processing class X of, in my case, 334. So I can, as I'm watching, I can kind of know where I'm at. And then I start processing each of the classes. I grab the class name. From the class name, I actually use I query the API and get information about the class. And if it's successful and it finds the class, it then grabs the first teacher listed in that class, and then it stores that in the teachers. And then I actually go now and query Google Workspace to see if there is a class already existing in the Google Workspace with that same name. And I use the GAM tool to do that. I'm using the last line there is GAM info course and then the course name. And if that exists, it will store the results in a variable called results. It then looks at that variable, and if that variable is empty, there's nothing in it, that means there's no Google Classroom over on the Google Workspace side, and we need to create one. So what it does is it actually uses the GAM tool to do that. First, it grabs the teacher's name from the XML that it got when it queried the class, appends at foxcroftacademy.org to that first teacher name, and then creates the Google Classroom using the GAM tool, GAM create course name, class name, alias, class name, teacher, teacher's name, status archived with that information. So now I've created my class if it didn't exist. If results wasn't empty, that means there was a class. And then it gets a little interesting in that we have to do a little check here. What can happen is between semesters, a teacher of, say, a biology course may change. So over in Jamf Pro Server, the teacher may have changed. And now when I'm trying to sync it with the Google Classroom in Google Workspace, I have to update the teacher. And this is where things get a little complicated. You can't change the owner directly. Once you've created a class with an owner, you can't just say, all right, I want the new owner to be this other person. Once you have, say, a class set up with the owner and a teacher, the only way you can change the owner is to another existing teacher. So if, for example, my class is owned by me, I'm the teacher, only teacher and the owner, and now next semester it's going to be Mr. Rattano, I can't just say change the owner to Mr. Rattano. I first have to actually add Mr. Rattano as a teacher, then change Mr. Rattano to the owner, which then makes me just a teacher, then do another change to remove me as a teacher. So it's a couple little steps to doing that. And that took me a while to figure out. And that's what actually happens in the next part of this script after the else statement is it goes and gets the owner of the class. It then gets the owner of the class from Google Workspace, and it gets the first teacher listed in the class in Jamf Pro. And if those are not equal, it does that little swap where it actually uses the sync, to add that Mr. Rattano in my example as a teacher. Then it calls the GAM tool again to change the course owner to Mr. Rattano. Then it will do another sync with the full list of teachers where, in this case, I wouldn't be on that list. It would then make Mr. Rattano the owner. So that's the only part that's really kind of wasn't very obvious when I first wrote this. But once I do that switch, or if the teacher and the owner do already match, I just go right into getting the list of the teachers from the XML that I got from the Jamf Pro server and just creating a list in that spool file in temp. And then once I've created that list of teachers, I use the GAM tool to sync my teachers. So the next to the last line here, GAM course, I'm going to have my course name, sync. I'm telling it I'm going to sync my teachers, and I tell it where the file is located. And that does my sync. Now I've ended up with a new class or an updated class with an updated list of teachers. Now I have to do the same thing for the students, which is just a nested loop where it goes to it grabs each student, each static group from my user groups in Jamf, and then cycles through those, creating a list of students from the students in that group. And then it goes to the next group and just appends those. So it's creating a list of all of my students in the class. And then at the end, it does a sync and it syncs the students to that class. And now I'm ended up at the end, I've got a class with updated teacher list and an updated student list. So basically the bash script does the same thing. It has a little bit different format to it. Again, I set some variables, my base URL, my API username. I'm getting my API user password again from that same file in Etsy, telling it where my spool file is, telling it where the GAM tool is. I also now tell it where my starlet command is, because that's what's I'm going to use to process my XML. And I also tell it what my curl command is going to be, so I don't have to type that out every time. It again, first line here, reads in all the classes using curl and querying the API and getting a list of the classes. Does a for loop where it's processing each class. It's getting a list of the teachers, and it's getting the course information. It's getting a list of the teachers from the API. It's getting the course information using the GAM tool. And again, if it doesn't return anything when it looks for the GAM, when the GAM tool looks for the info of the course, it's going to create a new course with the teacher name and creating it archived as well. And again, if it does exist, it's going to go through that process of checking the user thing and swapping out the user if the owner and the teacher, existing owner and teacher, don't match. So if it goes through that, it syncs at the end. It syncs, creates a new file with the teacher, the list of teachers from the class. It syncs that. I end up with my course and teacher list, teachers updated. I then have to go through and do the same for my students. Another nested loop here, just like in my Perl script, grabbing each of the groups, from each of the groups, grabbing all the students and writing them to a file, then processing the next group, appending it to that same file, and then doing a sync to update all my student files, all my students from the file. So now at the end, I've got all my, I've got an updated class that matches, I got an updated class on Google Workspace that matches my my Jamf Pro class. So it runs through all that for each of the classes. And some of the limitations of my script, one of them, the biggest one, is that the GAM tool is not fast. It does its job, it does it well, it's just not speedy. So it actually takes about 40 minutes for me to process all 334 classes. So that's a little bit of a hindrance. One of the other problems that I had with this, one of the other limitations, is that even though when I update an owner with the GAM tool, I update it, it updates fine. It's still a little slow because of the GAM tool. If I then query it again, it shows that it's updated the owner. But somewhere back in the depths of Google, it doesn't actually update the owner instantly. And when it tries to do the sync, sometimes it hasn't seen that owner has been updated and it fails. So what I end up having to do is usually run the script twice, which isn't a huge deal for me because teachers only change at the beginning and ending of a semester. So I may have to run it once and it fails several times updating classes. I run it again and it all succeeds. So students may change a lot, but teachers don't change a lot typically during a semester. Another limitation is that it's only set up for one site, just because that's the installation that we have. Some of the things I'd like to do in the future are actually add support for multiple sites, because we do have some partner schools. I think that would be pretty easy. I would like to figure out some way to actually cache the information on the Jamf Pro server side, so that if my class hasn't changed, it doesn't actually have to run and try to update Google Classroom, because that would actually speed up the script a lot. If there's no changes, don't even try to run it. Don't try to do an update. And the last thing is it's using the classic API. I probably should get it up to the newer API. So that's the script we have. I hope that's of some help to anybody out there. Really check out the GAM tool. It's pretty powerful, not just for this, but for other things. So thank you.